importance of food security around the world and the impact that the changing face of farming was having on biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And so today we've put together a panel headed by Sarah Stokes-Alexander, the Director of Environment at the Keystone Center, to really begin to talk about that in light of a publication that some of the panelists were involved with here for Rio Plus 20, and then have some interactive discussion as well, not only between the panelists but between the audience. So we hope to make this an interactive session, albeit a small session in the number of participants, but our hope is to really begin to raise this conversation within the larger IUCN family. And if you've looked at the new program going forward within IUCN, it's one of the main strands that we hope to address in the future. So, Sarah, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Keith. It's our pleasure to be here today. As Keith said, my name is Sarah Stokes-Alexander. I work for a nonprofit organization out of the United States called the Keystone Center, and our objective is really to improve public policy in the areas of energy, environment, and public health through bringing good dialogue and good science together across stakeholders throughout public and private sectors. So we do a lot of work at the crossroads of interesting issues from agriculture and the environment to all other kinds of crossroads that you might imagine are emerging as we are more interconnected and realizing the interconnections between things like climate abatement and air pollution, for example. So we get to do all kinds of fun things, but some of the most exciting work we're doing right now is actually at this intersection of conservation, food security, and agriculture. And so it was our pleasure to help pull together a panel today to talk a little bit more in depth about not only this important topic, but really try to take a little bit of a dive from a variety of different perspectives on where there are areas of agreement of where we need to move forward to be able to simultaneously meet what seems like an insurmountable demand of increasing food production and actually improving the access and availability of food to people who are already hungry today, let alone future generations who have yet to join us, as well as the potentially seemingly insurmountable issue of conservation and biodiversity and where these two things intersect. So we've pulled together a panel today with a variety of diverse perspectives with this. Andrea Thanis is a Senior Program Design Officer from the African Wildlife Foundation. So we'll be providing some perspectives from her work, really working at landscape level in East Africa on how these things work together. We have Ilva Stiller, who's the head of social policy and performance at Syngenta, who's been really working at this from a corporate perspective and from an agricultural business perspective of where are the opportunities to move these issues forward. And Syngenta's been involved in a lot of efforts to really look at this crossroads in particular between biodiversity and agriculture and how they as a company can contribute positively to that environment. Ibrahim Thiaw, who's the Deputy Director of Environmental Policy at UNEP, is also joining us and will provide that perspective, really important perspective of one of the unifiers out there trying to make sense of all of this from a global perspective, from UNEP's perspective, has joined us, and I think is probably fresh off an airplane to be here with us. So thank you for being here, Ibrahim. And then Julie Shapiro, who works with me at the Keystone Center, who's one of our senior facilitators and a real leader on our agriculture work, is going to conclude with some remarks about collaboration and things that we've seen work in terms of pulling together some unusual alliances of producer groups, conservation organizations, and the private sector to address some of these issues. We've asked each of the speakers today to take a look at this report that Keith mentioned that was prepared in advance of Rio Plus 20. And this was a collective effort on a number of organizations and people to really go out and survey different perspectives on agriculture. And again, in particular with a focus on sustainability and how agriculture can really complement environmental objectives as much as possible and not compete with them. And so the report surveyed perspectives from conservation organizations, environmental interests, private sector interests, government interests, UN interests, and really try to get a conceptual map out there of where are there really broad areas of agreement of where we need to move forward, and where are there areas of disagreement. So this report got a lot of input from a lot of different perspectives, but it was not produced in a way that we brought a bunch of people in a room together to really hash out the differences. So we've asked the panel today to really look at some of the outcomes of this report, which is really where are the areas that that there still seems to be some fundamental disagreements in agriculture, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. And then where are there areas of consensus? And you'll see in these areas of consensus, these are really action items. You know, where is there enough agreement to be able to move forward? And so we've asked the panelists to really reflect on what that looks like. And of course, it's always easy to gravitate to the areas where we're lacking consensus. And I think that where the report, while it's actually a phenomenal piece of work and was, I think, the single most downloaded document going into Rio Plus 20 in terms of the preparatory documents for Rio Plus 20. So that gives you a sense of how important of an issue people see this being to the environment going forward. Some of these may not be framed correctly. We did have the benefit of dialogue amongst these different perspectives. They were able to provide input, but not go back and forth about what these look like. So you'll see even that how the report has framed some of the areas lacking consensus, they're somewhat binary in their approach. So the panelists, in talking to them yesterday, may challenge the way some of these issues are framed. So again, you know, some of the questions around small scale farming, large scale farming, you know, some of these debates around farm size, debates around technology, are GMOs a part of the solution or a part of the problem going forward? Is agrobiodiversity really an answer that can both meet conservation goals and feed the world going forward? The whole question of livestock, so the notion that we need to double our production in the next 50 years is really based somewhat on a presumption that that the demand for meat is going to increase as hopefully economies improve and people have more wealth to spend on their food. What does that do to our system, and is there agreement on what that actually does to the system? Issues of trade. So again, some of these go outside of the normal realm and focus. And again, they're all captured, sorry, it's sort of down here on the bottom, but if you go to un.org and look at the documents preceding Rio Plus 20, it's agriculture and food and the future of sustainability. So I put the link to that on all of these pages.
It's also on the CEC website.
And it's on the CEC, IUCN CEC website as well. So the areas of consensus, again, hopefully, this is important that these are, there are more areas of consensus, and they go into greater detail in some ways than the areas of disagreement. That we do need organized farmers at a small and medium level, including women farmers, to be a part of the solution here. That we're not just trying to, push out small producers as we look towards the scaling up. That human nutrition means more than just producing more. That there's a bigger picture there around nutrition, not just more production. That high yields and healthy ecology are not mutually exclusive. That we are going to need higher yields to meet this, while also looking at the ecological implications of what we're doing. That we need diverse sets of technology. We need a diverse toolbox to address these issues. That we need to reduce waste. I know through most of the world, almost 50% of the food that gets produced gets thrown away. There's potentially a solution to the problem in that notion. That diverting crops for biofuels may not be the best idea when we're facing food shortages. That we need to measure, sorry, there's a typo on number 7, but we need measurement of what we're trying to do, that you can't really know if you're getting there if you're not measuring your progress along the way. That we need private institutions that can respond to a new set of goals around agriculture. And that we need to put into the marketplace rewards and incentives for good investments that meet some of these objectives. So again, lots of good areas of consensus as well. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to our panelists. We're going to ask Andrea first to, I've asked each of the panelists to give us, spend about 10 to 15 minutes just providing us with their perspective on this work in terms of where they see the areas of consensus being really opportunities to move forward, either this list of disagreements or others that may be providing roadblocks that if we could get to agreement on might move us forward. So I've asked Andrea to start us off with sort of the conservation perspective, and then Ilva to speak from a private sector perspective. Ibrahim will provide us the UN, sort of the bigger picture from the UN family, and then Julie will wrap up with again some of the solutions that we've seen helpful from a collaborative standpoint. I'm also, based on my attendance at this conference today, going to take advantage of this panel. I was in the session on youth and the inheritors yesterday, where we were talking about how do we really up the level of youth leaders and engagement in conferences and discussions like this. And when we all got together, this was not by design, but we have some very bright young women on our panel today. So I've also asked them to think a little bit about telling their story about how they got involved in this, because this is not your typical panel on agriculture over here, for those of you who've been there. So I thought it would be interesting actually just to hear their stories a little bit about why they're passionate about these issues, how they got involved. So we'll do that after they do their initial comments. And from Ibrahim as well, from a different perspective on that as well. So making no precise judgments on the age of the panelists here, it seems like a good opportunity to just leverage some of those other conversations that are happening at the conference here today. So Andrea, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, great, thanks. Thanks, Sarah. Is this working? Yeah. Nice to be considered young. I'm liking this assessment. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. It's really a privilege to be part of this whole approach that you've designed together with the United Nations Department on Economic and Social Affairs for convening a diversity of perspectives and views around this important issue of food security, agriculture, and biodiversity. And congratulations to you, to the whole team at the Keystone Center, to the partners that contributed to it, Eco-Agriculture and others, in producing what is really quite a remarkable and almost a Renaissance piece in the form of the report that went into the UN Rio +20 process. The topic of the session and the report itself are relevant to all of us globally, but particularly relevant to those of us who work in Africa. And where we point out that it's estimated that 1/3 of the population is suffering from food insecurity. And at the same time, the agriculture systems are impacting on wildlife and biodiversity at a remarkable rate, where agriculture is one of the leading causes of habitat loss and fragmentation, encroachment into wildlife corridors, and dispersal areas, and where the systems really are not producing either for the people of Africa, for the wildlife, or for the ecosystems that both of them depend on. So things clearly need to change in the African context, and the remarkable thing is that things are changing, and they're changing at quite a pace. So in the African Wildlife Foundation, we are committed to conserving Africa's biodiversity and natural resources while leveraging the continent's tremendous endowment for economic growth, for improved livelihoods, and for its people. AWF works through an approach of large landscape conservation, which we call the heartland approach. And these are areas that are biologically rich and support and maintain healthy populations of wild species and natural processes well into the future, including in the face of anticipated climate change. Agriculture, including pastoralism, is a feature in every single one of the landscapes that we work with across sub-Saharan Africa. The two that I'm most familiar with, and I'll draw from, as include the Maasai steppe in northern Tanzania, and the Kilimanjaro system that straddles the border between Tanzania and Kenya, and then also some new landscapes in southern Tanzania that are part of the Southern Agriculture Growth Corridor. That is one of the massive economic investments going on in Tanzania for agriculture development. These landscapes hold a mosaic of land uses in each one, including core conservation areas, which are usually parks or forest areas, forest conservation areas. And they also include small farms, larger farms, urban settlements, pastoralist land, and so on. And it's from these experiences that I'll be speaking about three of the key areas of disagreement between that you highlighted in the report. In particular, I'll speak to the issues of will large or small-scale farming best deliver food security? What role should corporations have in that system? And how can we adapt to the growing demand of livestock and livestock products? But before going into those responses, I want to say a word about the areas of consensus, actually. And to say that those areas of consensus resonate with what we're seeing happen in the agriculture systems in landscapes where we're working in sub-Saharan Africa. Investing in organizing and supporting small and medium-sized farmers, including, and I would say in particular, women, and involving private enterprise, if it's planned deliberately and carefully, can be one of the most important pathways to improving food security in Africa and maintaining ecological systems and habitats, such as forests. AWF has facilitated just this kind of investment through our private sector lending arm, the African Wildlife Capital, which is a mission-related investment company. And AWC, the African Wildlife Capital, has invested about $1 million in a company called Rumwe Avocado Company that supports, the investment is to support the expansion of an outgrower model that involves smallholder farmers in 21 villages in the Southern Agriculture Growth Corridor of Tanzania in order to supply Tesco's, the UK chain, with fair trade avocados. And the key to delivering conservation outcomes, from this investment is the careful design of covenants that bind the producer and the smallholders to practices which uphold the ecosystems and the services they provide in the landscape in which the avocado company is producing. So both on-farm and off-farm actions. These actions include things like carefully controlling pesticide and other input use to avoid harm to wildlife and pollinators, monitoring on-farm as well as off-farm wildlife populations, and reporting and investigating on mortalities of animals, and informing wildlife authorities of special sightings such as predators and threatened species. The covenants also set out consequences for actions that are incompatible with the forest and wildlife conservation, such as poaching, charcoal production, and unsustainable resource extraction from the forests and national parks. So the covenants were drawn up on the basis of prior knowledge of the areas that are a priority for conservation and landscape, and a careful consideration of the threats to those areas. In other words, getting the investments in small and medium-sized farmers right from an ecological perspective requires work up front to understand the broader landscape in which the investment is happening. Involving a private sector helps by providing access to technologies, knowledge, markets, and by stimulating the local economy. And so careful planning and secure tenure regimes and credible governance are all needed in order to ensure that the private sector engagement is beneficial both to the smallholders and to the environment. So this lesson is reflected in experiences shared across the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group. And recent research produced by that group has found that spatially explicit agriculture and rural development planning is key to optimizing conservation and food security outcomes in Africa. AWF uses a combination of macro zoning and participatory land use planning to guide our work in the heartlands overall, and particularly in agriculture. This means identifying ecological, socioeconomic, institutional, and the institutional attributes of landscape at a landscape level, including threats, potential conservation programs, existing capacity, and potential partners. And then using that information, we design interventions in the landscape, including the interventions in the agriculture and livestock sectors. So how small and large-scale farming deliver food security, the role that corporations should play in our food systems, and how we adapt to the growing demand for livestock are all dependent on what we know about the landscape and how we plan our interventions with communities, governments, and others in the participatory planning method. So getting to the questions that are outlined in terms of areas of disagreement, the first I'd like to address is, will large or small scale farming best deliver food security? And I guess I'd quickly answer that question is, it depends. But the reality of in landscapes in sub-Saharan Africa is that it's really a combination of large and small scale farming that's going to deliver livestock food security and food security for the African population. Africa is dominated by